Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. This is Patricia Kong from Scrum.org, welcoming you to this month's Scrum Pulse, where I am joined by Nick Easton and Valerie Pearce from NetHealth. Today, what we're going to actually be talking about is how they use team self-selection to reorganize their scaling initiatives. So Nick Easton and Valerie Pearce we're implementing a Nexus at NetHealth, and this is a really interesting exercise that they did, where they took all their teams and said, "Hey, let's reorganize. Let's use self-selection to match our scaling initiative." So I asked them to share their experience because I've been having a lot of conversations with different organizations who are looking to learn from why an organization would do this, and not only just why, but how they would facilitate something like that. So today I'm going to be your moderator, giving the introduction, and Nick will talk about some of the reasoning behind their scaling initiative, and then Valerie's going to actually walk through the details. So if we can get to the next slide, please. So just some quick guidelines. Your microphones will be muted throughout, but feel free to put in some questions. We're going to be taking some questions during the Scrum Pulse. And you can put that into the question panel. There's also a chat panel if you'd like to chat there. You can tweet your questions to @scrum.org and also use hashtag #ScrumPulse. Next slide, please. A little bit about Scrum.org. Scrum.org is the home of Scrum. I'm sitting in our headquarters today in Burlington, Massachusetts. We are a mission-based company working to improve the profession of software delivery. And we do that really through a few different ways, through training, education, and assessment. So we have a community of professional Scrum trainers, I think around 215 of them now around the world, who train our courses around professional Scrum. We have certifications and assessment to validate learning, and a lot of resources for you to help you improve the profession of software delivery also. One of the ways we do that is through the Scrum Pulse. So this is a free webinar by Scrum.org, and that's generally, I think, run about monthly right now, and there's a lot of different themes. I've participated in a few and giving content around topics like Nexus, which is the scaling Scrum framework, around evidence-based management, around women in management. But you can see there are several other themes that we have, maybe around empiricism and agility, building trust and respect between business and IT. So you can plug in and see different videos on our resources page. We also have a YouTube channel. And we would love to get requests for future sessions and what ideas and things that you're thinking about. So you can always tweet that to us with, again, the hashtag @ScrumPulse or @Scrum.org. Next, please. So today's presenters, yours truly, I'm moderating today. My name is Patricia Kong. I'm the product owner of Enterprise Solutions. So I think about what we do outside of the team so we can get that goodness into the enterprise. I'd like to introduce you to Nick Easton and Valerie Pearce. So Nick Easton, he actually serves as the Agile coach. He is the Scrum Master on the Nexus integration team, which NetHealth calls the Nexus Scrum Master. He launched the community of practices and introduced evidence-based management at Nexus, especially during their scaling initiative, which in my opinion shows that he really liked to put some skin in the game. By trade, he's a software engineer, but like I said, right now he's serving as the Nexus Scrum Master. Valerie Pearce, who in my opinion has one of the best accessory games in the industry. She's always wearing the best earrings and things like that. But she is on a mission to become as T-shaped as possible. I've talked to her about actually being pie-shaped because she's showing some very special skills. She's a senior software architect at NetHealth, but spent most of her time in 2016 and 2017 leading the professional Scrum transformation at NetHealth and implementing Nexus. These are both great people who walk the walk in terms of Scrum values. I got the pleasure of meeting them probably about, I think in 2017, as they started to implement the Nexus at NetHealth. and it was actually through one of our public classes in Burlington for SPS. And I remember it very vividly because I remember we have a lot of people, but I remember in the classes, but I remember Valerie and her colleague Kim during a break steering at the Nexus poster and having a very serious discussion about it. And that it caused me to ask them, how are you doing? What are you thinking? And they had talked about their story of sharing an implementation of Nexus. So let me do a quick introduction of Net Health. If you could click to the next, Valerie. There you go. So Net Health, they're based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. They offer software solutions for healthcare professionals. They're known for specialized outpatient care and offer an end-to-end solution for their clients. So they serve 98% of the nation's largest nonprofit and for-profit hospital chains. So what they're doing is very important in terms of reaching out to that industry. And because of that, they have this motto and this mission of the art of the right fit. And that's the foundation of a platform that they've built to serve the people in the healthcare industry. So Net Health has 300 employees. They're working across different offices and also work from home employees. So they'll be able to share more around how they did this team self-selection with that dynamic. I am going to today kick it over to Nick and Valerie. They're going to be giving most of the content. Again, Nick is going to lay down the foundation of the scaling journey and the reason behind the team reorganization through self-selection at Net Health. And then again, Valerie's going to share the details of the event as she facilitated it and walk through that process. So please feel free to chime in with your questions today. We'll be monitoring them throughout the presentation, and we've left enough time for you guys to participate in a Q&A at the end. So over to you, Nick.
Thank you, Patricia. Can you hear me okay?
Hear you perfectly.
Great. So I'd like to start off with a little bit of background information on why Net Health implemented Scrum and then moved on to Nexus. So we first adopted Scrum in 2014 because organizational leadership had a large new initiative and couldn't afford not to start the work right away. So we couldn't really wait for an exhaustive requirements phases as we had done previously. We had little to no agile experience as an organization, and I think we, to some degree, underestimated the amount of change required that we, needed to get the value from an agile way of working. And slowly but steadily, we started to move towards an agile way of working, and we scaled from 2 Scrum teams to 5. I think the biggest challenge there was that we were still operating in both an agile-ish and a waterfall mode at the same time. If you fast forward a couple of years, we had teams operating in silos, not really communicating with each other very well or very often. We weren't regularly integrating code, even though we were working from the same code base. We sometimes built conflicting features, and we were really just unable to scale any of the meaningful conversations we were having. We were also in a scenario where business analysts weren't on Scrum teams. There were several people in a product owner role, also not on Scrum teams. So we implemented the Nexus Framework, and several months in, we realized through inspection that we needed to adapt our teams. We needed to change our teams. And having been to Scrum.org, Scaled Professional Scrum, the Nexus training, we decided to put our money where our mouth was, and we decided to do a team formation.
So Nick, one of the questions that always comes up in a scaling conversation, and you brought it up here, is around the product owner role. So one of the things that the audience is wondering about is, what did that structure look like for your product ownership at this point for Net Health?
Yeah, so we had a VP of product. We also had 3 or 4 product managers who each had a product owner reporting to them. And we also had a product owner that was on the Nexus integration team. That was essentially the structure.
So a lot of people wearing some sort of product hat. Okay, got it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Could you go to the next slide, please? So what's the thought process around a team formation? Imagine like we're showing here, you have 3 knobs. You can adjust to optimize your outcomes. You can adjust the teams, you can adjust the work, and you can adjust the architecture. We knew that adjusting the architecture was just going to be too expensive. We knew that the work was pretty well defined, so we knew what we wanted to work on. And so we believe that it only made sense to adjust the teams. Next slide, please. So why self-selection though in general? We believe that Scrum advocates for self-organization, and as practitioners of Scrum and Nexus, we believe that self-organization gave us the greatest chance for successfully delivering on NetHealth's business objectives. So we wanted to allow each individual to choose his or her Scrum team.
Nick, just who is the we here when we're looking at this?
Yeah, so great question. I would say that the we here is a collective we, but what I would say is that Valerie at the time was the Scrum Master for the Nexus integration team Scrum Master, and she coached the organization on the concept of autonomy, mastery, and purpose. So autonomy is our desire to be self-directed, mastery is the urge to get better, and purpose is the desire to do something that's important, right? That has meaning. So the organization really, on top of that, has always valued highly engaged and highly satisfied team members. So we kind of put all that together and thought that all of those things are going to lead to highly satisfied team members, which will only increase productivity and efficiency.
Thank you.
So to dig in a little bit more about why, we had teams, roles, and product needs that had just changed over time, and we use these needs to drive our constraints for the team formation. We knew, like we said before, we wanted business analysts to be on Scrum teams. We wanted to spread out the knowledge and expertise that was concentrated to only one Scrum team to the rest of the Nexus, to the rest of the Scrum teams. But moreover, we wanted to support a greater investment across the Nexus in building our platform and increase flexibility across the teams to support any future platform strategies. So to dig into what the actual constraints were, about a month before the team formation, functional managers and other stakeholders of the Nexus got together to develop constraints for the teams to organize around. And this was a great opportunity for the organization at large to discuss the pros and cons and gray areas about when self-organization is appropriate and to what extent. Because self-organization was a complexly new concept for us, but given our experience with the principles of Agile, we took a small step in separating out the what and the how. So we attempted to focus on stakeholders defining what we were trying to accomplish with the new teams, and then for the Nexus members to figure out how to accomplish it. So again, separating out the what and the how. So this is where we landed. You can see it on the screen here, is that we wanted one business analyst per team. We wanted at least one senior software engineer per team. We wanted at least one junior or mid-level software engineer per team. We wanted a software to QA engineer ratio no greater than 3:1. At this time, we had software and QA team leads, and we wanted no more than one of them per team. We wanted at least 3 of the current Scrum Masters to stay on as Scrum Masters to keep that consistency and continuity. And there was a very specific constraint, lastly, that 3 team members that were experts in one of our products had to stay together to kind of carry on that knowledge. And to kind of talk about what we actually did next, I'm going to hand it over to Valerie.
All right. So how did we actually conduct our team formation workshop? First, we did lots of preparation. I was the Nexus Scrum Master on the Nexus integration team at the time. And as Nick said, I worked with stakeholders to articulate what we were trying to accomplish that you've seen as constraints. We held Q&A sessions for any participant who was interested in learning more about what to expect. The hardest part was finding a day about a month out where there was no PTO. So we scheduled the event for that day. We reserved the biggest room in our headquarters building, and we encouraged participants who were in one of our remote offices to travel to our headquarters office. We invited functional managers to observe, but asked them not to interfere with individuals selecting their teams. We did this to build confidence in this concept of self-organization. And then on the day of the workshop, which was June 28th, we started with an overview of logistics, which I'm going to run through now. So the whole goal of the workshop was for each participant selecting their team to stick a card they would be given, a Nexus member card, onto one of 5 team boards. Seems pretty straightforward. And at the same time, have all stakeholder identified constraints met across all 5 teams. And you'll notice I'm going to talk a lot about stakeholder constraints. They were front and center throughout the workshop. So each participant would receive a Nexus member card, and these were 5 by 7 inch stickable, restickable, really sturdy cards so that they would survive the day. They had print, a font large enough to see from a distance. And on the cards themselves, there was any information about the individual that was relevant to the stakeholder constraints. So in addition to the person's name, there was their title. As you'll recall, Nick talked about a couple of constraints that were based on senior software engineer or junior mid-level engineer. We included whether this individual had a team constraint. And this only applied to 3 individuals to keep kind of the knowledge together on one team. And an individual's Scrum Master status. Had they been a Scrum Master, were they currently a Scrum Master? And each team member would also receive voting cards. And we came up with this idea because we wanted a really quick mechanism throughout the workshop to poll the group on how they felt about what we were doing. And we wound up using the cards for a variety of purposes, a variety of topics that came up throughout the workshop.
Valerie, we have a couple questions coming in right here. So the first one is when you were talking about title. What do you guys define as a team lead?
Sure. At NetHealth, our software engineering team leads and QA leads are individuals who kind of have a technical leadership as well as a people manager role.
Okay. And then why the Scrum Master status, please?
Yeah, so if you recall, one of the constraints that our stakeholders identified is that we really wanted 3 current Scrum Masters to continue to be Scrum Masters for continuity. So we just wanted that information to be very transparent on the Nexus member cards.
Excellent, thank you.
All right, in the room, this really big room that we had reserved, we set up 5 large empty team boards around the perimeter. And we wanted to make sure there was enough space between them for people to walk through the room, gather around at team boards. And next to each team board, we hung up the list of constraints as a checklist. We wanted our goal, what we were trying to accomplish, to be front and center. We were going to allot a 10-minute time box for individuals to walk through the room and add their card to the desired team board. And we really encouraged individuals assembling at each board to talk about the emerging team makeup, whether or not constraints were met, and people knew whether it was appropriate. They knew whether the constraints were being met and whether they should think about staying on that team or possibly moving to a different team. So after this 10-minute time box, each team was asked to speak to whether or not they were meeting the constraints. And if the team wasn't meeting constraints, we talked as a Nexus about what we would need to do to meet them. Then we did a vote of confidence after each team had talked to the constraints. Green meant I'm really confident about these teams we formed. Yellow, I have some concerns that we should discuss, but we might be okay. And red meant I have major concerns about these teams. And we found that red was a good indicator that constraints clearly weren't being met and we had to try something different. So after we had started the workshop with that logistics overview, we got started. Individuals found their card. They were color-coded by department or by role. Blue for business analysts, green for quality assurance engineers, yellow for software engineers. You can see a nice picture of the actual workshop there. It was nice to be able to see visually what does our team make up in terms of skills. Participants were given the choice when they got their member card to indicate if they were interested in becoming a Scrum Master. Again, we wanted that transparency about, is there at least someone on this team who would like to be a Scrum Master? We made sure there were extras of everything just in case. We had a couple of promotions, staffing changes, even in the week leading up to it. We wanted to make sure we were all set and good to go.
Hey, Valerie, we're getting a couple questions around the Scrum Master role here. So in your model, the way that your Nexus functions, were your Scrum Masters also development team members, or were there dedicated Scrum Masters to the team? Or is that something you were looking to transition to?
Sure. At the time, we had only kind of part-time Scrum Masters. They were a member of the development team and also served as a Scrum Master. We've moved a bit, experimented a bit beyond that as of late, but at the time, that's what we had.
And you at that time were the Scrum Master. You were solely serving as Scrum Master, right?
Yep, that's right.
For the Nexus. Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Thanks.
And we wanted, with the write-in ability, we wanted people to have the opportunity to grow and really indicate that they wanted to grow into a Scrum Master role.
Excellent. Yep.
So we started with a practice round. And the reason we did that practice round is we wanted people to get comfortable with the format, be able to experiment kind of freely with what it would be like to have 50 people in a room, pick the team they want to be in, and also satisfy all of the constraints. That practice round turned out to be pretty useful. We learned that it's going to be hard. So it gave people kind of a heads up about the real team formation and what challenges we'd have to collectively solve. And following the practice rounds, we were prepared to kind of rinse and repeat up to 4 times. So why 4 times? We didn't assume it was going to be easy to meet constraints. And this repetition or threat of repetition had an impact on the collective problem solving. Our challenges became clearer after the practice rounds and after each round that we conducted. And it kind of encouraged people who didn't want to spend their entire day doing this to actually get down to business and solve the constraint problems.
So one of the things, it's especially as this is the first time that you guys were doing this and really taking a chance, I think from all the teams in the Nexus and just even as an organization. So safety can be an issue, right? When we talk about things, and you're giving this ability to use red cards. So then actually, did anybody ever use a red card to say, hey, we have a major concern about this. We don't like this. We would prefer, and you can see some scenarios behind there where it's just because everybody would prefer to stay in their own team. Can you talk us through some of the setup there?
Sure. We definitely saw red votes in the first round and in the practice round. And they were primarily we're definitely not meeting constraints. So those red cards became a trigger for us to say either we're going to solve this or we're going to go into another round, kind of reset everything and dive into a fresh round.
And how many rounds did it end up taking? They're wondering.
Yeah, in addition to the practice round, we spent 2 rounds until we got to teams that worked. And that kind of constraint check and vote of confidence at the end of that last round, it still wasn't perfect. It wasn't perfect in terms of voting. We still had people concerned, we still had red cards, and we talked through them and people moved, collaboratively to find something we eliminated all the red votes and got to almost all green votes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Thank you.
Sure. So we closed the workshop by building consensus on a couple of things. We wanted to figure out a time frame for teams to self-organize their Scrum Master, since for us, the Scrum Masters were kind of key in coordinating communication across teams. We wanted teams to come up with some new team names, and as it turned out, we self-organized a theme, and it just kind of emerged of team names that were a combination of an animal and a natural disaster. So we wound up with names like Alpacalypse and Narwhalacane. So that was fun. We wanted to figure out, at this point we were in the middle of a sprint, we wanted to figure out a timeline for when the new teams would take effect. Some people wanted to really plan out carefully. We have teams who had refinement runway on their work. How do we transition that refinement to the new teams? How do we transition that targeted work to new teams? Others really wanted to rip off the Band-Aid and say, hey, we're in the middle of a sprint. Let's start at the start. Let's change teams at the beginning of the next sprint. And it turns out that we chose that latter option. We ripped off the Band-Aid because during this wrap-up part of the workshop, people talked about a creative way to transition work targeted to the old teams onto the new teams.
So did you do it mid-sprint, or did
oh, so
mid-sprint?
The workshop was mid-sprint. The new teams took effect on day one of the following sprint.
Mm.
We wanted to figure out our NIT representation. So how would each of the new teams be represented on the Nexus integration team? And as a Nexus at NetHealth, we triage our production products. So we wanted to figure out a way to kind of share the load, share the work in production triaging. And during this wrap-up period of the workshop, teams figured out how to share the production triaging fairly. All right, so that's how we actually conducted the workshop from front to end. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Nick, and we're going to get into some of the things that we learned by forming new teams through self-selection.
Thanks, Valerie. So the first thing we learned, and we may have learned this before we actually did the thing, was that teams didn't want to be reorganized. They felt, conflicted about reorganization from top down. People were conflicted about the constraints. So for example, we had constraints based on title, right? Not skills necessarily. And I think going forward, we'll probably care less about whether or not you're a senior software engineer and more about the skills that you bring to the table. We also, added BAs to Scrum teams, and they got to pick the teams that they wanted to be on, whatever made sense for them and for the work that we were going to be doing next.
And we also found that several people really welcomed the opportunity to switch teams. They appreciated that they could choose what team they were on. This was something new for us. They wanted to learn new things and work with different people. And on the flip side, some individuals chose their team because they really didn't want to change teams, but constraints were met, and this was fine. We also found that people moved teams for the benefit of the entire Nexus. So in these rounds of team formation, when we saw lots of red cards, someone may have really wanted to be on a team, but they saw that by them moving, they could solve the constraint problem, and so they did it. Individuals really stepped up for the good of the whole Nexus. This whole workshop and this whole process leading up to it really built trust between teams and between leadership and teams. Teams showed leadership that given some clear constraints, they could successfully figure out how to meet them and self-organize into new teams. And leadership showed teams that they were willing to try something they've never done before. Define the what, but not the how. What traits do we want to have on each team, and enable self-organization to make those traits emerge. And I also learned that facilitating and coordinating this workshop across 60 to 70 people was a real significant undertaking. And I think that was really important for its success.
Well, congratulations. So thank you to both of you and to NetHealth for being so open and sharing this experience and especially even on this side, just sharing some of the conflicts. So I have some follow-up questions, but we certainly have several questions coming in that are around what you learned, but also just a little bit more detail around what's going on. So one of the questions is really about the concern around reforming teams. So what's interesting is you're talking about, when you talked about the formation, when we talk about Scrum teams, it's not about the individual, it's about the benefit and how do we deliver as a team. And then when we talk about Nexus, when we're scaling, we're saying, okay, how do we think about the Nexus where several teams are working together to build something, and how do we operate at the benefit of the entire Nexus? So we're looking at something that benefits as an entire system, not just as the parts and the ebb and flow. But one of the things that we talk about is that when you're reforming a team, you're potentially hurting the ability of the individuals to gel as a team, and you might be, getting a hit on velocity. What did you guys see there? Was that a concern for anybody when you were thinking about this?
Yeah, I think it was a real concern. We really wanted predictability as an organization into, our velocity. We thought we really valued that. Individuals were really, really concerned about, kind of that reforming. How am I going to learn to work, build new communication patterns with my team? But what we found was that the Nexus framework enabled us to think of these concerns more as a nexus. It brought the whole question of team cohesion up to a nexus level. And because we were all in this together as a nexus, it made this new forming of Scrum teams within the nexus, it made it more seamless.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Was there, and there's some really good questions that are following up on that. So what kind of executive buy-in did you guys have from this? And you showed the stakeholders, which I'm assuming here is the management and the executives, but how did you guys handle executive buy-in? How did that whole process work? And let's imagine that new leadership comes in. Do you guys think that this model would stay in place? So at what level of sponsorship did this come from for either of you?
That's a really great question. So the sponsorship at the time of the team formation came at the leadership of all of product development in NetHealth. And I think there were key functional managers all the way up through executives who were involved in, really deciding, yeah, we want to do this team formation and supporting it and coming up with the constraints for it. I think at this point, the Nexus framework is kind of baked into our culture. I mean, it fits. So if there were a leadership, I think transition, I think you stated, I think it would work well. I don't really have any concerns.
Mm-hmm. And it's so important, and I think that question really gets to the heart of when we talk about, Nick explained how you guys started using Scrum, and then I remember the story of, the reason you came to Nexus is because someone said we have a scaling problem. Let's visit this. This is the Nexus guide, and then having that bottom up initiative and then the top down support is really something that's necessary to have agility thrive in an organization. Some more questions, if I may. So there's Teresa Shine, and you have great questions. So do you think there's a sustainable cadence to repeat this activity, or have you guys set the teams for life?
I think there is definitely always room to evaluate and reevaluate the composition of your team. And I think that you don't necessarily have to wait for an event or a formation like this to make sure your team is composed in a way that allows you to be successful. As for Cadence, if you feel like you regularly look to the future, maybe twice a year or something, like from a roadmap perspective, maybe you could use a cadence like that. But I don't know that there's any one particular hard and fast rule for any of this.
Mm-hmm. So that leads kind of to this follow-up. So you talked about, hey, we're looking at our roadmap, and you showed some stakeholder identified constraints earlier, Nick. Do you guys still consider those to be, did you consider those constraints to really be successful and useful after the teams were formed? What experiences would you say, hey, we might do this to think about the constraints? What could you inspect and adapt for next time in terms of those constraints? What would the conversations look like with the stakeholders?
Right. So, I think with any of this was the first time that we had done this, so there was definitely a learning curve, and I think that the constraints were successful because we learned from them. And like I had alluded to before, I don't know that we'll necessarily focus so much on title, so not software engineer 3 or whatever, but more about I have skills in this particular area. I like to work on this type of thing, and organize around that. There might be we want to look at team sizes to make sure they're not too big or too small, but I think that we would focus again more on skills and less on title.
So since you've done this workshop, I know that NetHealth has grown in size. What do you think is the limit that you'd be comfortable facilitating this for? When we talk about a Nexus, we talk about somewhere between 3 to 9 teams, let's say up to 100 people. Do you think this could be done for more than the 60 to 70 people? Could it be done at 100, 150, 200? What do you think would have gone on?
I think you could definitely do it. 100 people, let's say. So, if you had, I don't know, 9 people on each team or something like that, maybe a little bit less than 100. But I don't know how it would go, honestly, above that. I do put a lot of faith in self-organization. I put a lot of faith in people's ability to step up and be a hero type of thing. So I do think it might be a little bit more challenging, right? The more people you have, the more dependencies potentially. So you might need to add another step or two in there. But I do think it would be possible.
Right, and I would chime in that I think this took, you mentioned, about a half a day. So when you think about just the size, it's about clearing those calendars and seeing what can happen. But the other thing is really having that support of, if we're going to do this, and having some clear constraints and boundaries of how many rounds you're going to take, or when you're going to conclude that you are done. And also just saying, hey, do we have the management support of whatever happens with these 50, 100, 150 people, that we're going to support this for a little while. So getting back to the questions, this is an interesting one. How did you handle, and because we're talking about the constraints and the composition of the teams, how did you handle UX design? Were they embedded in the teams?
That's a great question. We do have UX design skills, but we don't have enough individuals who really specialize in that to have a constraint per team that each team has those skills. So we approach UX skills as kind of as a nexus. How do we share the people with those skills?
Mm-hmm. And there was one here then. So if you have the new teams that were formed, how did you manage rapid response types of work where a particular person, let's say you have an expert that needs to work on a specific issue?
I think we wanted to consider that when we did the formation in looking at what our work was going to be for the next several months, and making sure that we didn't put ourselves in a scenario in which we were creating external dependencies, or maybe not even external dependencies, just dependencies with another team. We were trying to do everything we could to make sure the teams were aligned, to the constraints, but also that we weren't creating a bunch of dependencies as well.
Something else I think we really like about our Nexus is that if there's an individual with skills that another team needs, we don't hold hard and fast that these are our teams. We might say, teams might coordinate, hey, person X, can you join our team for the sprint to help us with this particular skill? So that's been a really helpful kind of fluid sense of where skills need to be for a sprint.
And that's a lot around self-organization. And we've had a lot of conversations, I think, from this between Net Health and Scrum.org about how this has really called out self-organization and the bottom-up intelligence that Net Health has really been looking at. Okay, so you guys have been growing. So how have you been weaving in new hires into these teams?
So usually, a person will come in and we take it to the Nexus, essentially. So, take it to the Scrum team, take it to the Nexus. What do you guys want to do? Would you like to have some kind of rotation thing? Would you like, to go a different route? And we essentially allow the Nexus to figure it out. If somebody feels like they need to, add a person or whatever, they can do so. But we try to make it smooth, but also let the Nexus decide really how it goes.
Okay, and that's a great thing to hear. It's interesting because we're going back. There's a lot of questions around the constraints. So this is a two-part question. So let's think about it this way. So did you know your constraints beforehand, or was it discovered through the process? I guess, of your scaling initiative? Did you guys write down the constraints and meet up as a stakeholder group beforehand? How did those constraints come to be?
So yeah, we had scaled in Scrum, in effect, by starting to use the Nexus framework several months before we did this team formation workshop. And in probably 6 or so weeks ahead of time, we had worked with the stakeholder group to have these clearly identified constraints. So everybody knew what the constraints were at least a month in advance of the workshop. Oh,
okay. That's very interesting. So, and one of the constraints that you had identified was saying, hey, we have business analysts in one team. We'd like them to spread throughout. Someone's asking here, can you describe the roles or responsibilities, and let's say at Net Health, of your BAs, product owners, and product managers? And has that changed since your implementation of Nexus and this reorg?
Sure. So it definitely has changed. We have since moved away to one product owner who works with the product managers, and the product owner essentially has a team of business analysts that she works with to make sure that anything that she needs we're doing from a business perspective, from a product perspective. All of the business analysts are now on Scrum teams now, and no longer report to separate product managers.
Excellent. And so one of the things that could be they're wondering as a follow-up here, the listeners are, did you have, and for how long, if you did, have a Nexus before this exercise, this workshop?
Yeah, as far as the timeline, we had started looking into Nexus about a year before this workshop. Started our Nexus Sprint 1 probably about 6 months before this workshop. And we started with our existing Scrum teams, just scaling using Nexus.
Excellent. So You're starting with your existing Scrum teams, and you're scaling into a Nexus. And one of the things that you talked about was not only are we doing this reorg workshop, but hey, when we change throughout, when we go through different sprints, sometimes somebody might join a different team, and this is for the benefit of the Nexus. A question here is, if a person switches a team for a sprint, and they put Scrum Master, but how do you communicate, how do you consider capacity changes or your impacts to the roadmap, and what are the hits again that you're getting, and how do you report on that when you have these changes in the teams?
Yeah, so we talk about changes like that pretty openly in an environment where anyone can kind of join and listen in, and it's very transparent. And usually we are making the switch because we don't have what we need to do what we need to do, and like most other things, right? We're focusing on the most valuable thing we can do at the time. So the offset is again talked about, and if it's a calculated risk, it's a calculated risk, but everybody kind of knows about it. As for capacity, you can take into account that a new person is going to be joining your team, and a person may be leaving your team, right? But numbers only get you so far. I think at the end of the day, it's a gut check about what the team thinks that they can do and when.
And then at the end of that, we talk about value, right? So if it's just if we're looking at capacity, but we're balancing that with value with all the evidence-based management work you're doing with the Nexus, Nick, right?
That's exactly right.
So here's an interesting question around personnel, and I promise I'm only going to give you a couple more questions. One of the things that you talked about was the no more than one team lead per group. Was there a structure before where it was the team was reporting into that team lead, and if you changed that, did it cause any sort of personnel issues? And do you feel that having a team lead in general is counter to self-organization or the empowered self-organizing team?
That's a great question, and I think it's something we're actively inspecting and adapting. Back at the time when we did the team formation last year, it was common for our software engineering team leads to be on the Scrum team, and all of the individuals on the team reported to that person. We really strategically wanted to kind of break that tie. We didn't want to have to, if an individual moved from one team to another, we didn't want them to change who they reported to. And for our quality assurance team leads, they typically weren't on Scrum teams. So what we've learned and what we're experimenting with is how to really leverage people managers and how to leverage technical leadership without a reporting structure on a Scrum team.
That will be an interesting experience to share back with the group, I think.
Sure.
Yeah. So in terms of constraints, so did you guys consider location then as something? So if we're talking about these different structures, is location that was something that was a constraint? Because you talked about you have 4 regional offices, you have some remote people, and if it is a constraint, will you continue to have that as a constraint or not?
Sure. For us, that wasn't a constraint. We have a reality that we're not going to have a co-located Nexus. So we try to approach a lot of what we do in remote-friendly ways. Nick, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think at the time we did things like kind of have a liaison during the actual formation that you could be on the phone with if you weren't in the room, which was super helpful. But looking kind of how we're doing things now, and kind of going back to what I said before, very recently there were individuals that weren't or that were in the same location, but were working with teams that weren't in the same location, and just organically they said, hey, we think that it would be better if we co-located, and they split off and started their own team. So we do value that, and if people think that that's the best thing for them to do, that they should make it happen.
Yeah, and location is a conversation that always comes up in terms of scaling, right? That's a big conversation. How you deal with that, how an organization deals with that will vary. But as long as they're inclusive, that's a right way forward. So last question here, and Valerie, you actually just spoke about this at a conference, but why did NetHealth choose Nexus over other scaling frameworks? So why over SAFe? Why over LESS? Why over DAD? And that's the last I'll do in terms of promotion of other scaling frameworks.
Sure, I can start with that. And Nick, I'm curious if you want to add anything. But we were familiar with Scrum. We looked into what options were out there, and knowing what at the time of scaling, we thought our biggest pain point was that we had 5 teams operating in silos, and code integration was really challenging. It was at the time of code integration that we learned about feature conflicts, and sometimes we're getting ready to package up a release, we're merging code, and we found that we built a feature that conflicted with another feature in the same sprint. So at the time, we thought Nexus it's Scrum. It's just scaled Scrum focused on this relationship or connection between people or things. And it really made sense to us to solve that problem. We didn't know that it was actually going to really help us with so many other things. We did look into other frameworks, and I think we wanted simplicity. We wanted that focus on collaboration that we found in the Nexus framework.
Yeah, I would just add to that and say, yeah, right. Nexus is still Scrum. It's scaled Scrum, and we were comfortable with Scrum for the majority of the organization. And the other thing I wanted to add there is, it came from the bottom, which I think meant a lot. So one of our Scrum Masters at the time had found the framework, raised it, and we made it happen. And I think that was a huge part of it.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that part of your journey. I mean, it's just so interesting and refreshing sometimes to say, hey, here we have a problem, and as a team, as a group, for the betterment of this organization to serve our customers, let's just look for an easy solution and let's not break our back doing it. And that's what I hear. In closing, let's see if we can get to that. So Valerie, if you can transfer to me, and I'll show the closing slides. Just even based off of all these detailed questions, what we know is that there are people out there who are listening to this, so that are thinking about doing something like this, who will benefit from maybe just having the details of how they could do this, or they might consider how they could host this or facilitate this. So they might be using this to conduct a similar exercise as if needed. I think the other things that we've learned today is that, when we're working and we're thinking about self-organization, let's consider what's a benefit for the whole Nexus, rather than just individually and, what our politics gesture. So you guys have shared a really great story, and I hope other people can learn from that. But we have other things here, so you can see that you can connect with the Scrum.org community. If you have more questions, you can participate on the Scrum forums. That's where practitioners like Nick and Valerie can answer your questions, engage in a conversation, but also with our professional Scrum trainers. This is only one of many webcasts, so there are tons that you can go back and replay on our resources page. I've certainly conducted a few around what is Nexus, what's an introduction to what is this Nexus, why would we be even forming a Nexus, what does a Nexus in action look like. You can see here, what is Scrum? That's an important one to share with teams too. So learn from a variety of different people, including our trainers. If you don't like to watch webcasts, then read a blog. So we are putting out all this information to help with our mission of improving the profession of software delivery. So we're always putting information out there and topping out and writing about different topics. So you'll find some different things in our blog. And at the end of the day, I'd really like to thank you guys for taking an hour out of your days to participate, Nick and Valerie, to give this experience and share this experience that you've had, but also to our listeners who are participating. So a big thank you, and Scrum on. Thanks, everyone.